Oklahoma is the land of second chances. Who were the people that made it so? We'll dig for the golden threads they've woven through Oklahoma history. The Red River Institute is proud to present Oklahoma Gold. I'm Gwin Faulconer-Lippert, along with award-winning author and Southern Nazarene University historian John J. Dwyer. We'll find the golden nuggets of Oklahoma history here now. Oklahoma Gold. Mother of the Civil Rights Movement. John J. Dwyer, tell me her story.
Gwin, I'm just constantly amazed at how much unknown Oklahoma gold there is right here. And indeed, Clara Luper. Some of our listeners have heard of her, but a lot haven't. We all need to. She grew up in rural communities in segregated Oklahoma as an African American born in 1922. As a girl, she saw a sign outside a nearby town that read, "Negro, read and run. If you can't read, run anyway." She experienced sitting at the back of trains, not being allowed to try on clothes in stores, and exclusion from restaurants, libraries, bathrooms, and phone booths. Well, by 1957, the semi-centennial anniversary of Oklahoma statehood, Clara Luper was ready to step out and do something about the unjust practices of Bible Belt, Oklahoma. She said later, I'm quoting Clara now, I'm going to share as many of her thoughts as I can. I think people would rather hear from her about her life than me. And she said later, we could go in and cook at restaurants, but after we cooked, we couldn't eat. And that's a bad thing to do. Give a person the right to cook the food and then refuse to serve them. They treated us, African Americans, as if we didn't belong to the human race. This was confusing to me, how a person could wash your dishes, cook your food, set the table, but then you would not allow them to eat. This was hard. So my answer was, yes, tonight is the night. History compels us to go, and let history alone be our final judge. So what was her plan on that summer evening in 1957? Well, it started at the old Calvary Baptist Church, 300 North Walnut in Oklahoma City, now a law office. And it was at the suggestion of her 12-year-old daughter, Marilyn. Calvary was a church where Martin Luther King himself wished to become pastor just a couple of years before that, before he came to national prominence. But he was apparently not invited because of his then youthful age of 25. Well, from Calvary Baptist Church, Clara and her N.A.A.C.P youth group made their way on foot on the sidewalks to the large and popular Katz Drug Store in downtown Oklahoma City, flagship of a 38-store chain throughout the Southwest and Midwest. And there she and 13 of her students, ages 6 through 17, sat at the lunch counter where blacks were not allowed to eat, and they ordered Cokes. And though they were refused service, so began in Oklahoma the national sit-in movement of black Americans seeking equal rights as whites and other races to admittance in public establishments. Now, Bruce Fisher, the son of the famous Ada Lois Scipio Fisher, Ada was the first African-American student admitted to the University of Oklahoma, and Bruce, her son, a longtime historian at the Oklahoma Historical Society, he recalled that, quote, Clara Luper did something with those young students that could not be done by force of law. She was not trying to change the law. There was no constitutional question of whether separate but equal was legal. What she was trying to do was change the customs, the attitudes that had existed in Oklahoma at that time. And so began Clara Luper's pilgrimage as the mother of the civil rights movement. Years before the purported beginning of that in Greensboro, North Carolina, which didn't happen until 1961. Clara Luper said concerning the John A. Brown department stores, which most people from Oklahoma that grew up anytime from the 20s through the 80s would know about John A. Brown's, the dominant kind of the Walmart / Dillard / Penny's of those generations. She said, we're not mad at Brown's. We're encouraging people to trade with them. We'll give them good for evil. I had read, as many of our workers had, that the quickest way to freedom is through nonviolence. Brown's, again, was a store that would allow African Americans to buy, but you couldn't try on clothes because black skin might get on clothing and it would rub off on white skin. That was the mentality at the time. Well, Clara's actions did not come without a cost. She was jailed 26 times for nonviolent civil disobedience. The people who opposed her, she said, were all church people. I felt sorry for them, she remembered. I was not angry with them. I understood the system. I felt that this was their training back to their great-grandparents. And in fact, she followed Martin Luther King's example of nonviolence, turning the other cheek. The black community, meanwhile, mostly reacted indifferently to her. Once you're used to discrimination, she said, your parents have been discriminated against, your grandparents, you become a victim of discrimination. This is what happened to black folks. This is the way it's been. It's the way it's always going to be. There were jail-ins, there were read-ins. While we were sitting in, our kids were preparing to live in the real world. So they were reading. Out of that experience, from our volunteers, we got doctors and lawyers, a lot of people that have gone to the top. In fact, one of the top brain surgeons in the United States, Roger County, started when we were down there sitting in. He wanted to be a doctor, and I said, if you want to be a doctor, memorize all the bones in the body, the vessels, the veins, and the arteries. And that's what he did. Luper also recalled one of the kids who had the experience of reading during that time, and decades later, she was voted the best principal in all the United States public schools. Luper recalls that many whites supported her efforts, including conservative white Governor Raymond Gary. And here's what he said on the steps, the south side of the state capitol, which are still there. Raymond Gary. I'm sure there are no special outside, that is separate but equal, rooms in heaven. God is no respecter of persons. Prejudices, and we all have them, are contrary to the will of God. Raymond Gary continued, other nations laugh at us because the Constitution guarantees equal rights to all men. We preach one ideology, but we appear to practice another. The peaceful integration of schools, and that's the end of that quote, the peaceful integration of schools and other public institutions championed by Governor Raymond Gary helped prevent in Oklahoma the much greater racial strife and violence experienced by many other states across America. Clara Luper, meanwhile, remembered both a Presbyterian pastor and a Catholic priest among the many white people that caught serious flack for helping out her cause. In fact, in her words, they were both run out of town for helping. There were a lot of white people that wanted to see the change, she said, but if they would come out and support us, they'd be isolated from their friends and neighbors. There were many business owners that knew if they would come out and support us, they would lose their white customers. Well, for over 40 years, Clara Luper toiled teaching the young people of every color of Oklahoma, beginning at Dungy High School just east of the Oklahoma City School District. And in just a moment, we're going to talk about some of those experiences in the classroom of Clara Luper, and then a golden nugget that I think is pretty sure to both inspire and tug at your heartstrings.
John J. Dwyer is stitching the past to the present on Oklahoma Gold. She was the mother of the Civil Rights Movement, 1957 in Oklahoma, while elsewhere it was 1961. And she believed in giving good for evil. John J. Dwyer, what is the golden nugget of Clara Luper?
Well, Clara Luper was a successful teacher, had her master's degree from the University of Oklahoma, one of the first African Americans that got that, when she launched into something she didn't have to do, the civil rights movement. But for 40 years, she taught the students of Oklahoma of all races and socioeconomic castes. One of her thousands of former students wrote that, I had Mrs. Luper for government at John Marshall High School in 1987. It was the best class I ever had. When you walked into her classroom, there was a huge banner on the wall that said, Welcome to Luperland. She made learning fun. She set the class up like the actual government. You had to actually get voted out to leave the class if you had to go somewhere else. I had to change schools mid-year, and she made me write a letter of resignation to resign from my office in the class. Well, most 20th century Oklahoma blacks, Gwin, who labored for social, political, and economic fairness, were dogged and unflagging, yet nonviolent. For many of them, including Clara Luper, their Christian faith was the most important factor in their life. In fact, her charitable Christian convictions permeated every area of her life. For instance, she said some years ago, before her death in 2011, "I would like to see a war where old men have to go and fight. That would be the kind of war I would like to see." Clara Luper, always kicking against the traces in the old phrase. Well, without Clara Luper, the Clara Lupers of Oklahoma, the E.P. McCabe's, the Roscoe Dungees, the N.A.A.C.P. Fishers, and even the Raymond Garys and many more, just how just would our state now be? And what good and great deeds by person of African descent and others of color would never have been accomplished? So, the golden nugget you've been bugging me about. So what was Clara Luper's inspiration to risk so much when, as we said, she was already a successful, well-educated school teacher with degrees and well-respected?
And jailed 26 times?
And jailed 26 times. Some of that came from the famous Oklahoma City sanitation workers strike in 1969. Which we'll cover in detail in Volume 2 of the Oklahomans, and she was right in the middle of that. Helping keep it peaceful, though, something that could have exploded into violence. Well, here's how she recalled it, Gwin. 1957, on the precipice of thinking about walking from the Calvary Baptist Church downtown to the Oklahoma City Cat's drugstore, where black folks could not so much as get a Coke at the counter. They could get it and go. They couldn't sit down. Clara Luper remembers, "I thought about my father, a World War I veteran, who had died shortly before in the Veterans Hospital, who had never been able to sit down and eat a meal in a decent restaurant. I remembered how my daddy used to tell us that someday he would take us to dinner and to parks and zoos. And when I asked him as a little girl, when was someday, he would always answer, 'Someday will be real soon, honey,' as tears ran down his cheeks. My daddy taught me to work hard and do my job no matter how small, so well that no one could do it better. Then he would yell out, 'Whatever you do, don't quit. Just keep on believing. Believe in the stars when you can't see them. Believe in the sun when it isn't shining. Believe in the rain during extreme periods of drought, and keep on believing in a God that you have never seen.' Although my daddy," Clara Luper remembered, in her later years, "now sleeps in yonder graves, I still believe." And I think this is very interesting and a marked contrast from this African-American hero of a different generation to so much that we hear today about people that are not liking our country at all and wanting to tear it down. That was never her intention. In her own words, "I still believe. I believe in the Declaration of Independence. I believe in the Constitution of the United States with its amendments. I believe in the lessons of patriotism that I learned back in Hoffman, Oklahoma. Songs like 'My Country 'Tis of Thee' still bring tears to my eyes. I love America, in spite of the walls that I have seen. Yes, I recall the walls of segregation, discrimination, and hatred. Yes, I recall bitter memories, but I also have sweet memories of blacks and of whites that have soothed my self-esteem with their prayers, their love, their concern, and their support." Well, what did, in the end, being a Christian mean to Clara Luper? Having been jailed 26 times, having been threatened, having been mocked and scorned, having been marginalized and cast out by many in her own African-American community, having faced all sorts of danger, including physical danger, in marches, in sit-ins, and strikes. In the end, and we hear the words of the great Dr. Martin Luther King echoed again, being a Christian to Clara Luper meant expressing Christian ideals all wrapped up in one package. That's called love. That's all I have to do is love. Love your enemies. If you can love, you can live.
Welcome to Luperland. That's Oklahoma gold.